Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I would like to have your attention. Just checking if the presenters, all 7 of you, are now here in the hall, in the room. Okay, 1 and 2, Professor Marazi, 3. We need another 4 of you guys. Let me just read the names. Safiyyah Sabreen Syeed, okay, you're here. Zain Raza and Right Nawaz, not yet here. Maybe they are still in the hall. Ibrahim Dahiru Idris, for others. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Assalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma aftah alayna hikmataka wa anshur alayna min khaza'i rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Rabbi shrah lana sudurana wa yassir lana umrana. Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon. I bid to everyone here in the room as well as the ones in the Zoom session. So this is a parallel session. We are having 2 sessions going on together, one in the hall, in the main hall, and one here with us with Professor Marazi as well as Associate Professor Dr. Nick. My name is Nahid Azhari. I will be the chairperson for this session. I welcome you all to this session 2A. The topic is integrating tradition and innovation pathways to revitalizing Islamic education and thought. So I welcome all speakers, esteemed scholars, and also all contributors as well as audiences in the Zoom, as well as here in the room. So without further ado, I would now call upon our moderator, Associate Professor Dr. Ni Azizi, to moderate the session. Please welcome.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear professors, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to parallel session to A on integrating tradition and innovation, pathways to revitalizing Islamic education and thought. Here at Ibn Khaldun conference room. Let's proceed to the next presenter, Madam Safiyyah Sabreen Syeed from Islamic University of Science and Technology, India. The title is Reconciliation and Islamization, a roadmap for an Islamic intellectual revival. Please welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jazakallah khair. Auzubillahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Assalatu wassalam ala Rasulihil Kareem. My topic is Reconciliation and Islamization, a roadmap for an Islamic intellectual revival. If I can have the slides, please. I would really thank the organizers and the patrons of this really brilliant conference here. I'm so lucky and privileged to be here. Very well organized, and I think it's a step ahead in a very grand, vision of Islam, global Islam revival. Yes. Okay. So the agenda is I've divided my presentation into 3 parts. Number 1 is I just want to give a brief overview of the characteristics of the Islamic intellectual tradition. What was it all about? What were the core features of this great scientific revolution that we had in the Muslim world? I would say from the 8th century till even the 18th century, we can find, a presence of scientific literature in the Mughal and the Ottoman and the Safavid empires. So one of the core features is the centrality of the Quran in all intellectual discourse. The Quran was central to all intellectual discourse. Number 2, a very broad epistemological landscape and the unity of the sacred and the secular, as Dr. Marazi just spoke of and Dr. Osman Bakr represents so beautifully in his works. So The Quran identifies I've identified eight valid epistemic sources apart from itself. So the Quran is the highest source of knowledge. After that comes the Sunnah. The human intellect is also recognized with Aql and Qiyas, which is Ijma, the consensus, and the moral consensus. Intuition, Basira, the physical universe is also a source of knowledge, and history and certain knowledge from other civilizations. That's why we had the Kalam tradition, knowledge coming from other sources. The second part of my presentation is the next slide, please. So the second part is the reasons for the Ummah-wide intellectual crisis. Why are we in a crisis? Why is it an intellectual crisis? There are external factors and there are internal factors. I'm going to be talking about the internal factors. And finally, obviously, everyone wants to know the solutions. What are the solutions? How do we deal with this issue of a global intellectual decline in the Ummah? So I'm going to take the inspiration from the Quran. The Quran says that we're going to, the Quran itself says that you will validate the truth of the Quran through your study of yourself. Allah will show us the signs of His truth within ourselves and the afaq, which is the cosmos, that we will know that this is the truth. So I'm going to present my solutions based on that. Next slide, please. Yes. So I'm going to be presenting a top-down approach of Islamization of science. Basically, practical steps. One is the bottom-up approach where we Islamize knowledge at the school level or maybe at the university level. But I'm going to go top-down. I'm going to Islamize science, give you 3 practical solutions at the level of the frontiers of science, research, at the top level of research, and then that'll trickle down. Yes, that's it. So I'm going to be using those. Let's get to that. Now, the core features of the Islamic scientific revolution from the 7th to the 18th century, that is the period that I've called Islamic scientific revolution. We're not really used to this term, the Islamic scientific revolution, but I think we should normalize this. Is number one, a paradigm shift. The kind of knowledge that happened before Islam, that is the Greek tradition, the Chinese and the Indian, that was very deductive, very theoretical. But with the advent of the Islam, as Dr. Fazlur Rahman Ansari says, that the Prophet ﷺ was the inaugurator of the modern scientific age. So the scientific intellect was created with the Prophet ﷺ. So in the inductive approach of science came about. Number 2 was that this tradition was very tawheedic. There was an underlying unifying principle of divine unity. That's why all sciences were unified because of that principle. So there wasn't a segregation between mathematics and the Quran. Imam Abu Hanifa was an expert at fiqh and also mathematics. He wrote on mathematics. And it influenced the modern scientific revolution. It was the Islamic scientific revolution that influenced the European Renaissance. Next slide, please. Number 4th is the centrality of the Quran in all intellectual discourse. That was a core feature of this tradition, the intellectual tradition that we had in Islam, was that the Quran was central. Whatever was taking place was in and around the Quran, through the Quran, inspired by the Quran. And there was a broad epistemological landscape, meaning that knowledge from different sources was recognized. It wasn't just the fact that only the Quran can give knowledge, but the Quran says that the universe can give knowledge, that the historical process can give knowledge, that other civilizations can give knowledge. That's why you had people who were, let's say, the Sufis, who got knowledge from different traditions, like even the Zoroastrian tradition or from the Greek tradition. And these were religious people. And there was no segregation between the secular and the sacred. It was not divided the way we have right now. I'm an engineer, and in my 4 years of engineering, not once did I learn anything about God or the Prophet or religious themes. That's because it's completely separate. We didn't have that in the Islamic tradition. Next slide, please. quickly, the sources of knowledge accepted by the Quran. If you read the Quran, firstly, you'll know that the Quran considers itself as the highest source of knowledge, calls itself the Furqan. It's the criterion to judge what is right and what is wrong. But there are other sources of knowledge as well. That is from the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ has been called the guide, the Uswa Hasana. The human intellect, Aql. That's why the Quran always says, Afala yaqilun. Ijma, as in the collective intellect. Intuition, basira, is also a form of knowledge. Knowledge from other traditions, the Quran talks about, why don't you ask people of other traditions? History is by being directed by divine agency. Whatever events are happening in the world today are all directed by divine agency. So it is a form of divine knowledge. And the physical universe, that means the cosmos in particular, the natural world, the world of the animals, all of these are sources of knowledge accepted by the Quran. And next slide, please. And with that, we can see that the people who took the Quran and the Sunnah together, they could be broadly termed as the Muhaddisun, or the people who concentrated on, let's say, history, were the Muslim historians, anthropologists, sociologists like Ibn Khaldun, or the people who concentrated on the Quran and knowledge from physical universe were scientists like Al-Biruni or Al-Jahiz or the Banu Musa brothers, and so on. So these people are converging different forms of knowledge, converging them with the Quran and producing different fields of knowledge altogether, like philosophy, like physical sciences, like fiqh, like mysticism. Next slide, please. So now the second part of the presentation. There is an intellectual decline and crisis in the Ummah. But what are the factors? One is the external factors that we can all talk about, that European colonization followed by Western hegemony. There's a unipolar world order in the world today, and we are being told to fit into that order. And we are being told to fit into the values of that order. And George Saliba, who's a well-known historian of science, notes that it was the discovery of the New World, which is the Americas, by Europe, its colonial conquest and the capitalization of science that could be attributed to the decline of Islamic science. So clearly there is a decline, and the external factors are this creation of a new world order, or this unipolar world order. But I don't want to talk about those external factors today. We're talking about the internal factors. There's a definition of decline I've had there. It was very nice. Professor Osman Bakr talked about decline, and he had a similar, like my definition of decline is pretty similar to what he had to say, that the decline of a community is when it fails to fulfill the purpose for which it came into being, its foundational principles. So what is the Muslim community's foundational principles? Is knowledge, is the creation of knowledge, is the dissemination of knowledge. We are a community of Iqra. So are we anywhere in the field of education today? Nowhere. So we are not fulfilling our purpose. That means we are in a state of decline. And the spiritual crisis is because of this intellectual crisis. Now, next slide, please. Solution. It's as easy as the explanation of the problem. The solution is to revive the same principles and the values that existed in the early period. If we can, they were in a state of ascent. If we want to go to the state of ascent, we have to get their values and their principles. So revival of that broad epistemological landscape. You're taking knowledge from different fields, you're integrating them. That's the integration of knowledge. And removal of the segregation between sacred and secular. And all great modern contemporary Muslim scholars have talked about this. Dr. Kamal Hassan would talk about it. Dr. Naqib al-Attas has talked about it. Dr. Osman Bakr has talked about it. Next slide, please. And in that, I'm going to now take you to a very, sort of a particular area where we can have like a practical case of Islamization. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He says, the Quran anticipates how a better understanding of the self and the cosmos will lead to a validation of the truth in the Quran. Meaning, if we understand the cosmos better, we can understand Allah better. So the Quran is calling for a scientific, empirical, sanurihim. Ra'a is to see. Basara, nazara, those are different words. Sanurihim is that we will show them our signs, Allah says, in the cosmos and fi anfusihim, in their own selves. And that would reveal the fundamental unity between the cosmos and the human being and the human consciousness. And that's where we will start our project of Islamization of science. Next slide, please. I'm going to take three cases in particular. Those are the frontiers of knowledge. One is the fine-tuned universe, and number two is the quantum physics, and the third is the hard problem of consciousness. This is like the top level of scientific research today. I'm going to assume that some of you know what the fine-tuned universe is and some bits of quantum physics. I can give you a little bit of introduction into that. Next slide, please. Let's go into quantum physics and the revival of Islamic physics. We are at a stage, a very important part of our history, Islamic history, that much of what we developed before in the Kalam tradition, the Sufi tradition, is actually being validated by developments in quantum physics. So these principles of inherent uncertainty or a lack of knowledge about the aspects of the universe, which is that the universe is indeterminate. You don't actually know what's happening in the universe at a particular time. So the universe is indeterminate. Those are core features of quantum physics. Now, observationally and empirically proved how the universe at the atomic level, when it's not being observed, is a collection of uncertain probabilities. And now those of you who've studied Kalam would actually find that very common with the Kalam aspect of the universe, that the universe is not deterministic, it is indeterminate. Next slide, please. And the great news is that the people who are already working in this field, we had, I think Dr. Basil Altai was invited by IIUM some time back. He has presented a model wherein he mentions 5 themes that Kalam, a form of Kalam, which is called Daqiq al-Kalam, engages in those 5 themes, has those particular 5 themes that can be integrated with quantum physics. He talks about them, like, for example, indeterminism of the world, temporality of the world, as in the world came into being with time, not in time, as in the world was created and time was created. That's in the Kalam tradition, atomism, and continual recreation of the world. So these are themes that he takes from the Kalam tradition and he takes from quantum physics and he integrates them and shows that there is so much overlap. And it's such a good, it's so heartwarming and so intellectually enlightening to know that our scholars have already talked about. They was so advanced. Next slide, please. We were very happy to have Dr. Mohammed Haj Yusuf, who gave his presentation in the morning. So his work is also quite paradigm shifting, where he takes the cosmological model of the great Sufi Ibn Arabi, and he creates like a mathematical formulation of that, trying to solve solutions, trying to present solutions to contemporary issues in science. Now, this is the highest level of scientific research. And these scholars are working and engaging at that highest level with the Islamic tradition. So that's how the revival of Islamic physics looks like. Maybe in the next 10 years, you could have things like this, where Islamic scholars are actually producing solutions to very, very difficult problems in physics. Next slide, please. Next is the fine-tuned universe. There's this idea that while the universe is very indeterministic, you cannot understand what's happening at a particular moment, but the universe is so delicately balanced, and when it was being created, that if there's a tiny little change here and there, that's it. Yes, I will conclude. If there is a tiny little change here and there, the universe would cease to exist, as if it's on the edge of, like, very thin edge. So that is something that we as Muslims, we can all agree with. That's what we've read in the Quran, how the universe is existing on a very delicate balance. Next slide, please. I've called it I've called it, they call this the fine-tuned universe cosmology. I've called it the God-held universe. So that's how it is. And obviously an explanation can be given on that. And the third and the last one is the mystery of consciousness and the development of an Islamic philosophy of mind. We had some speakers talk about neurophilosophy, but the actual core area is that we don't really understand how the consciousness works, how we have this inner experience. You and I are all made up of carbon, just like this table is, but we have a conscious experience. The table does not have a conscious experience, but why is the difference? So we can, in the Islamic tradition, we have solutions to problems like this. We can talk about things, and that's the area that I'm working on, which is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal has talked about consciousness and how the whole universe is an act. The whole universe is teeming with life and consciousness. Next slide, please. Yes, you can skip this one. Finally, what I've given you in this presentation are 3 levels. One is the reconciliation, then is the Islamization, then is the revival. So reconciliation is more or less like the integration, where we take aspects of the tradition, of our own tradition, and also the relevant aspects of modern knowledge from different fields. I've just taken science, you can take from economics or anything. Then Islamization is when you reconcile them, you put them together and you take the reconcilable elements. You cannot reconcile everything. And the third one is that will lead to revival. So it's a top-down approach. I'm not going from bottom up. That is the frontier of knowledge, of research. Next slide, please. And there you have it. You have suitable elements that we're taking, reconciling. That will lead to the process of Islamization. I've given you a practical guide, 3 areas. And finally, that will lead to a revival or an intellectual ummah-wide revival. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you, Dr. Safiyyah Sabreen Syeed, for your kind sharing and good presentations. So from the presentation, several conclusions that can be drawn may include the importance of reconciliation between Islamic values and modern intellectual development, and also the needs of intellectual revitalization within the Islamic traditions, and significant implications of the role of Islamic universities in this process. Thus, the presentation emphasized the importance of reconciliation and Islamization as steps toward an Islamic intellectual revival. Before we continue to the